Imagine sitting down in a movie theater with your popcorn, the opening crawl finishes, and you suddenly realize, Darth Vader was actually killed 50 years ago.
Right.
The Empire's entirely in ruins, the stormtroopers have gone completely feral, and the movie is literally just about a group of people having to walk in and, clean up the leftover mess.
Yeah, that is exactly the kind of jarring, convention-breaking scenario that tabletop gamers experienced back in 1982.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. For you listening today, we're going to look past the dice and the character sheets to excavate a cultural artifact, a publication that fundamentally rewired the architecture of how interactive stories are told.
The artifact we're talking about is the 1982 role-playing module, The Lost Caverns of Tsojcanth.
Designated as S4, right?
Exactly. Officially designated as Module S4, written by Gary Gygax for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and calling it just another adventure is, well, it's a massive understatement.
Right. Our mission with these notes today is to show you how this specific 64-page booklet acted as the ultimate missing link. I mean, S4 is the bridge.
The bridge between two totally different eras of gaming.
Yeah. On one side, you have the hyper-lethal, completely context-free tournament games of the 1970s. And on the other side, you have the incredibly dense, lore-heavy, world-building campaigns that would basically define the 1980s.
To really grasp how massive a philosophical leap this was, you sort of have to look at the environment players were used to. Throughout the late 70s, the standard game design was what we called the funhouse dungeon.
Just a random meat grinder.
Exactly. You were dropped into a location-agnostic meat grinder. There was almost no political context. You were just there to kick down doors and loot treasure.
But S4 takes that entire concept and throws it out the window.
It drops you right into the incredibly tense, politically fraught borderlands of the Flanez in the world of Greyhawk.
So you aren't just murder hobos in a vacuum anymore. You are explicitly sponsored by the Margrave of the March of Bissell.
Right, you're part of a strike team of 6th to 10th level adventurers.
And you are in a literal geopolitical race. You have rival political factions from Ket, Perrinlen, and Valuna, all breathing down your neck to find a ruined stronghold in the Yatil Mountains.
And everyone is looking for this legendary artifact called Dowd's Wondrous Lanthorn.
But the real hook is the person who used to own this stronghold, isn't it? An archmage named Iggwilv.
Iggwilv is the gravitational center of this entire narrative. The background lore tells us that nearly a century before the players even arrive, she conquered the nation of Perrinland.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she ruled for a decade through extortion, magical tyranny, and heavy demonology. Her ultimate act of hubris was summoning and successfully binding the demon Prince Gras.
Which didn't go well.
No, not at all. During a subsequent magical experiment, Gras temporarily slipped his bonds. Iggwilv managed to banish him back to the abyss, but that apocalyptic, localized arcane battle left her severely weakened.
And that's when everything falls apart.
Right. Seeing her vulnerability, her slaves and her bound supernatural servants immediately rebelled, looted whatever they could carry, and fled into the mountains.
Leaving the deeper caverns completely abandoned. Okay, let's unpack this. Because going into this dungeon isn't like sneaking into a James Bond villain's active, fully staffed volcano lair.
Not at all.
You aren't dodging patrolling guards. It feels so much more like, I don't know, picking through the irradiated fallout of Chernobyl.
That is a perfect comparison.
You're walking into a magical disaster zone decades after the meltdown. But I have to ask, doesn't it feel incredibly risky from a game design standpoint to completely remove the main bad guy from the story?
How so?
Well, as a player, I think I'd feel a little cheated if you sold me a boss fight and the boss wasn't even home.
It was a massive gamble, for sure. But what's fascinating here is how that absence completely changes player behavior. It forces them to engage deeply with environmental storytelling.
Because you aren't fighting Iggwilv, you're dealing with the mess she left.
Exactly. You have to deal with the feral remnants of her reign. You are walking into rooms and fighting bound demons whose magical contracts expired decades ago, but, they're still trapped in summoning circles.
Wow.
You're dealing with biological magical experiments that were just left breeding in the dark, and the descendants of former slaves who have devolved into absolute savagery.
So you have to piece together the terrifying history of this witch queen solely through the devastation she left behind.
Yes. And the climax of the module perfectly cements that theme. You don't find Iggwilv at the very bottom.
Right. You finally breach the inner sphere, the most protected part of the stronghold, and you find a woman in gold-chased plate mail sleeping on an alabaster slab.
Drelnza.
Yeah, Dronalza.
Yeah.
That is Iggwilv's own daughter, who was
Mm.
corrupted into a powerful fighter and a vampire. She's just this incredibly tragic guardian left behind in the ruins of her mother's ambition.
The whole thing is an archaeological excavation of hubris.
Which naturally brings up how the players actually conduct that excavation. Because the environmental storytelling wasn't just flavor text, right? It dictated the actual brutal mechanics of moving through the world.
Exactly. S4 bifurcates the adventure into two distinct mechanical phases.
Oh, the mountain phase is wild. Before you even smell the subterranean labyrinth, which, by the way, has this brilliant transition from natural, unworked stone down into abyssal corruption, you have to survive the mountains themselves.
Yes, you have to endure a grueling 3.5-mile hex crawl through the Yatil Mountains.
And we should probably clarify what a hex crawl meant in this era.
Definitely. This wasn't narrative filler where you just roll a die and magically arrive at the dungeon. It was a rigorous logistical simulation.
You had mountain horses to manage.
Right. If you didn't dedicate time to forage for food, or if you didn't make sure your mounts grazed properly in appropriate terrain, they would suffer hit point attrition from exhaustion.
So the weather, the rock slides, the sheer altitude, the environment itself was a hostile threat chipping away at your resources before you ever went underground.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Once you actually start clearing out these mountain caves and smaller layers, S4 introduces the revolutionary musical chairs wandering monster system.
Such a cool concept.
Usually in these games, monsters just spawn out of thin air because the person running the game rolled a random number. But here, there was a finite number of physical layers in the region.
And a separate, literal waiting list of wandering monsters.
Yes. Think of it like a twisted real estate market. You go in, you violently evict a clan of goblins from a cave,
Yeah.
and while you're back in town healing up at the tavern, the ecosystem heals itself.
A displaced manticore from the waiting list moves into the newly vacant goblin cave.
It's brilliant. But hold on, let me push back here.
Yeah.
This sounds utterly amazing for the player's immersion, but
Yeah.
wouldn't tracking all this off-screen migration be an absolute administrative nightmare for the poor person running the game?
I won't defend the paperwork because you're absolutely right. It was a total nightmare.
I can't even imagine.
But you have to look at what they were achieving. This system perfected what later designers called Gygaxian naturalism. It transformed the static game board into a living, breathing ecosystem.
Because the tactical landscape shifted in direct response to the player's actions.
Exactly, making the module endlessly replayable. But yes, the administrative burden on the dungeon master was staggering. Tracking lair occupancies, creature migration patterns, ecosystem balancing.
Not just a pencil and graph paper.
Right, it was incredibly tedious, which is exactly why this brilliant simulation was largely abandoned by the publisher in later books.
And that paperwork burden highlights a massive problem. If the world is constantly updating itself and requiring, like, calculus to run, the publisher, TSR, realized they needed to step in and help the people running the games.
And their solution was to literally start handing them a script to read.
Which is wild.
To understand why they did that, we have to zoom out and look at the corporate landscape of TSR in 1982. The company was in a state of absolute hypergrowth.
They were shattering the $20 million mark in gross sales, right?
Yes, they were terminating external licenses so they could manufacture their own toys and miniatures in-house. And to support this explosion, they brought in a massive influx of new staff.
How massive?
Well, to give you an idea, nearly 40% of the entire company's employees in August 1982 had been hired within the previous 12 months.
Wow. Meanwhile, Gary Gygax, the co-creator of the whole game, is becoming increasingly distracted.
Very distracted. He's out on the West Coast courting Hollywood executives, trying to get film and TV adaptations off the ground.
While trying to finalize the manuscript for S4 single-handedly.
And the effort it took is actually cited by historians as a major reason why the highly anticipated Temple of Elemental Evil module was delayed for years.
So he was stretched incredibly thin. And with this massive influx of brand new, totally inexperienced players and game masters flooding into the hobby, TSR realized they couldn't rely on people naturally knowing how to improvise a good game.
They needed to standardize the experience. So S4 aggressively accelerated a controversial toolbox text.
Now, if you know tabletop games, you know box text. It's those heavily stylized paragraphs of pre-written prose that the game master is instructed to read aloud, verbatim, the moment players enter a new room.
Yep.
It honestly reminds me of handing a substitute teacher a rigid, prepackaged lesson plan. You just read the bold words to keep the class under control. But did this prepackaged script actually elevate the atmosphere? Or did it just turn players into a passive audience waiting for story time to end?
This raises an important question, and it's one that sparked a massive ideological debate in the gaming community that is honestly still going on today.
Oh, absolutely.
On one side, proponents argue this hand-holding was completely necessary for the 1982 boom. It ensured that a brand new 14-year-old game master could convey a consistent Gothic atmosphere.
And wouldn't accidentally forget to mention vital environmental clues.
Right. But on the other side, you have the old-school Renaissance, the OSR. Their critique is that box text actively eroded the improvisational, conversational nature of the hobby.
It conflated atmospheric color with interactive facts.
Exactly, completely stripping agency and creative interpretation away from the person running the game.
And because it was a new tool they were rushing to implement, it led to some hilarious growing pains. Like, S4 contains the infamous Room 15 blunder.
Oh, that's a classic.
The box text, the dramatic prose you are supposed to read to your players, actually starts with the sentence, "The room is 15 by 15." And then seamlessly continues into a description of sleeping guards and an empty wine bottle.
It is so awkward.
It's this incredibly awkward moment where utilitarian mapping data, which should strictly be secret info for the game master, accidentally bled right into the dramatic read-aloud script.
It perfectly highlights the friction of formalizing a fluid game into a pre-packaged storytelling format. But what's truly ironic is that while S4 was standardizing this rigid narrative script for the 1982 masses, the adventure itself actually originated from the most rigidly scripted, unforgiving mechanical format imaginable.
A 1976 tournament.
Exactly.
Oh, this part of the history is wild, because S4 wasn't actually born in 1982. It started 6 years earlier as a 17-page typewritten tournament packet for WinterCon V in Rochester, Michigan.
Back then it was called the Lost Caverns of Tsojcanth, spelled with an O.
Right. Gygax knew there would be over 100 players competing, so he designed it as a ruthless, highly controlled gauntlet.
The rules for that 1976 tournament were designed to ensure absolute fairness across dozens of different tables, which meant they had to strip out all variance and luck.
So weapon strikes and spell effects used fixed mathematical average damage.
You didn't even roll dice for damage.
That's insane.
And wandering monsters were explicitly forbidden so that every single team faced the exact same resource attrition. It was a test of pure tactical skill.
You couldn't even bring your own character. You had to choose from 6 tightly pre-generated characters. You had Cathartic the Cleric, Ethelred the Fighter, Flemon the Dwarf Fighter, Dunil the Hobbit Thief, Weslock the Elf, and Hawkebreck the Half-Elf.
But here's the best part. In classic Gygax fashion, despite wanting a perfectly balanced tournament, he generated their starting magic items completely at random.
Which resulted in a massive statistical anomaly. 2 different characters ended up equipped with highly coveted magic swords.
And instead of fixing it for balance, they just left that anomaly right in the tournament packet?
It's a great quirk of history. But the most significant difference between the 1976 tournament packet and the 1982 published book is a massive lore retcon regarding Iggwilv herself.
Oh, a huge retcon. If you read the original 1976 text, Iggwilv was explicitly a male wizard who was decisively and permanently slaughtered by the demon prince Grost when he escaped.
He was dead and gone.
Dead and gone.
Right. But cut to 1982, and Gygax executes this massive editorial pivot. Iggwilv is transformed into a female witch queen who actually survives the cataclysmic battle with Grost and flees into the multiverse to scheme anew.
It's quite the change.
So what does this all mean? It's literally like George Lucas rewriting Darth Vader's entire origin story halfway through a movie franchise. How does a single editorial pivot in a Forgotten Convention packet end up reshaping the entire universe's cosmology?
Because that pivot changed the DNA of the franchise. By letting her survive and changing her identity, Gygax accidentally birthed the character who would eventually be known across the multiverse as Tasha.
One of the franchise's most enduring, complex, and beloved villains.
Exactly. Furthermore, keeping her legacy alive allowed S4 to act as the connective tissue for a massive geopolitical mega campaign.
So S4 wasn't just a standalone adventure anymore.
No, it was explicitly designed to be the high-level continuation for characters who managed to survive the Temple of Elemental Evil. And then, S4's wilderness map fed directly into the subsequent module, the Forgotten Temple of Tharisden.
Oh, wow. S4 became the anchor that tied all these disparate adventures into one cohesive, epic timeline.
But to populate this newly expanded lore-heavy universe, they realized they had a massive problem.
Veteran players.
Yes, you had players in 1982 who had memorized every weakness of every standard monster. They knew exactly how many hit points an orc had, or what a dragon's breath range was.
So, to keep them terrified, S4 basically acted as a massive stealth preview for the upcoming 1983 Monster Manual test.
Yeah.
Gygax throws an entirely new 32-page bestiary at them.
Exactly. Suddenly, players who thought they knew everything are getting absolutely blindsided by creatures they've never seen before, requiring entirely new tactical strategies.
Like the multi-legged draconic behir.
Which completely short-circuited assumptions about how reptilian monsters moved and fought. You also have the death-gazing bodak, the subterranean peck, elemental marids.
It also vastly expanded the extraplanar cosmology by providing the very first published statistics for major demon princes.
Right, like Baphomet, Kashti, and Fraser Blue.
And you can actually see the evolution of the game's entire thematic tone just by looking at what monsters they replaced. Like in the 1976 tournament, one room featured these bizarre, completely anachronistic Chinese hill giants.
Which made no sense.
None. But by 1982, Gygax swapped them out for Fomorian giants, deeply rooting the encounter in dark, mythologically resonant Celtic undertones that perfectly fit the horrific vibe of the Underdark.
But we have to give credit where it's due, because Gygax didn't design the geometry of those caverns entirely alone to hold all these new monsters.
Oh right, Rob Kuntz.
Yeah, the spatial architecture of the Greater Caverns owes a massive debt to his close friend and co-dungeon master, Rob Kuntz. Modern historical analysis shows that the map for the deeper caverns was lifted almost entirely from the 8th level of Kuntz's legendary Castle El Raja Key dungeon.
It's like a Frankenstein's monster of game design. You have Kuntz providing the skeleton these devious winding corridors and brilliant spatial puzzles, and then Gygax stitches on the flesh of his ecological world building and all these brand new preview monsters.
It really was a collaborative mashup.
But I have to push back here. With so many brand new monsters shoved into one underground space just to preview a new rulebook, doesn't it stop feeling like a natural ecosystem and start feeling like a bizarre artificial monster zoo?
I mean, it's a fair question.
I mean, why are all these wildly different apex predators living next door to each other?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your critique is incredibly valid, and it's actually the most common complaint modern reviewers make about the module. It can definitely feel like a haphazard menagerie,
Right.
but you really have to view it as the beautiful friction of the 1982 era. S4 is a transitional artifact. What you are seeing is the raw obstacle course logic of a 1976 tournament colliding in real time with the rich ecological campaign reward logic of the 1980s.
It's two different eras of game design fighting for dominance on the exact same page.
Exactly.
And you can even see that exact collision in the artwork and the cartography. The physical presentation of the module is wild. You have Errol Otis's iconic, surreal, almost hallucinatory cover art of the Behir fight sitting right alongside Jeff Easley's grounded, dark, oil-painted realism inside.
It's two completely different eras of fantasy art coexisting awkwardly.
Even the maps themselves show the growing pains of a rapidly expanding company working in corporate silos.
Oh, the map scaling issue.
Yeah, that incredibly detailed 3.5-mile hex map of the Borderlands we talked about. When players tried to lay it over the massive 1980 Greyhawk 30-mile macro map, it mathematically and visually misaligned.
The geography simply didn't scale correctly because the different design teams weren't perfectly synced up.
It's just amazing when you step back and look at the incredible journey of the Lost Caverns of Tsojcanth. It is genuinely staggering.
It really is.
It started as a brutal, typewritten tournament gauntlet in a 1976 convention hall where they stripped out the dice to measure pure tactical skill. And it evolved into this beautifully illustrated, massively influential epic.
It gave us enduring villains like Tasha, iconic new monsters, and literally changed the trajectory of how tabletop role-playing games approach narrative and world building.
It definitely did.
It set a new standard. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought regarding that musical chair's ecological system we discussed earlier.
Oh, the one that was too much math.
Right. Gygax's brilliant shifting wilderness simulation was abandoned in the 1980s entirely because the math was just too hard for human game masters to track with pen and paper.
Yeah.
But today, we live in an era of digital virtual tabletop tools, VTTs that are capable of automating massive amounts of complex background data effortlessly.
Oh, wow.
So, are we finally on the verge of reviving this lost mechanic? Could the ultimate living, breathing wilderness simulation that Gygax dreamed of in 1982 finally be realized by a new generation of players today using modern tech?
That is an incredible thought.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder what other visionary mechanics are buried in those old design notes, just waiting for the technology of today to catch up with the imagination of the past.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And the next time you step into a story where the main villain is long gone, just remember, you aren't just a passive audience member, you're on an archaeological dig, and if you aren't careful, you might just wake up what was left behind.